Well, thank you all for coming today. I'm gratified at the turnout. I'd like to just briefly mention that I am not, as a kind of a caveat, I'm not an Anthony Wayne scholar. So some of you may know a lot more about him than I do. But I ran across him and I was unable to tell this early history of Ohio and the Northwest Territory without Anthony Wayne, of course. And I just found him to be a fascinating subject. And he was one of the more exciting characters I've run across in my research and writing about the Midwest history. So I'm excited to tell you more about him, and I'm also pretty excited to hear what kind of questions you might have. So we'll try and allow some time for that. So the title of my book is Promised Land, and the reason for that is that when the Revolutionary War ended, the colonies in the New World here in the original colonies were pretty much crowded. The population was booming, lots of new immigrants, and people were confined to that little strip along the East Coast. And they really needed some room to expand and to stretch out and to find land. And when the first settlers arrived in what they called in those days the Ohio Territory, they found this to be the promised land. It was clean water, abundant game, fish, tons of huge timber to build homes and establish farms, and the river bottom land was extremely fertile and rich and great for growing crops. So I guess what this story is really, we'd say that this story is America's story. Because without the Ohio Territory and the expansion west, these original colonies would have sort of withered on the vine and have been trapped, and our nation would be nothing like it is today. So, of course, you can't tell America's story without starting with George Washington. We all know him in that picture in the upper right there as the father of our country, as the man on the $1 bill. We know him in the bottom right picture as the hero at Valley Forge who persevered through that terrible winter and somehow pulled the army together and made the comeback the following spring to begin waging war on the British and ultimately win. A lot of us may not know him as a surveyor. And he was a young surveyor. In those days, in the 1780s, a surveyor would have been sort of the Indiana Jones of his age. He was an adventurer, he's an explorer, he's wandering out into uncharted territories where nobody has been before except the natives. He doesn't know what he's going to encounter, and he goes out there and he maps the territory and he comes back and tells people what he's found. Now at the Museum Center here in Cincinnati, they have the Historical Archives, and it's a fantastic resource for research for books like mine. And in that, I was able to find some first-person writing of people who said that George Washington got as far west as Cincinnati in his surveying days. So that's an important thing to put a pin in that and keep in mind that George Washington knew the Ohio Territory from firsthand experience. He was an explorer who had been here. He knew the potential of the area, and he knew how important that would be to the growth of our young country. Another one of these early settlers was John Cleve Symmes. Around Cincinnati, the Symmes Purchase is this huge, vast tract of land between the Miami River, the Little Miami River, and between those two rivers, and with the Ohio River as the border on the south and all the way into the northern counties. So he was a Continental Congress delegate, a lawyer, a soldier. His daughter married into the Harrison family, which produced two presidents, Benjamin Harrison and William Henry Harrison. And he settled in North Bend, where he started a community. He sold hundreds of thousands of these acres to settlers. And his target as the first speculator in the Midwest was really a class of men who would be hardy enough to bring their families here. And they were Revolutionary War veterans. They came down the river on flatboats like this one, and they would come with their whole families, usually anywhere from 8 to 15 or 16 children. They would bring their cattle, they'd bring their sheep, their pigs, everything, and their farm implements and their weapons, and they'd float down the river on these little flatboats. And they were mostly Revolutionary War veterans, because as the war ended, the U.S. Treasury was broken and was bankrupt. They had nothing to pay these men for their service. So they offered them land in the Ohio Territory. And John Cleve Sims was waiting with the land available, and he was able to attract, with advertising, he was able to attract thousands of these families to come down the Ohio River. Unfortunately, this was also known at the time as the Miami Slaughterhouse, because the Miami and the Shawnee tribes, led by Blue Jacket and Little Turtle, were extremely warlike and hostile. This was considered their sacred territory, and they didn't want these settlers here, and they began to attack. So when the first people got here, if they were lucky to survive their boat ride down the flatboats, because in many cases they might turn a bend in the river and there would be a war canoe of Shawnee or Miami Indians waiting to slaughter everybody. Many of these little convoys of flatboats were massacred. If they were lucky enough to get here, they might stay in a place like this. This was called a station in those days, not a fort or a stockade, but a station. And they were all over the Midwest, especially along the Ohio River on the north side, where we had Fort Washington, we had Cobalt Station, Columbia Station, Round Bottom Station, a whole bunch of them. And they were really small little stockades where maybe 15, 20 families might gather and live there. And that's where they survived the cruel winter and did their best to farm and raise crops so they could make it through the winter and start over again in the spring. Some of the families, like James Kemper, he was the first ordained pastor in the Midwest, in the Northwest Territory. And he lived in a blockhouse that was very similar to this one depicted. And he had 16 children. He was quite a brave man. He would travel from station to station up and down the Ohio River at a time when the Indians were extremely hostile and dangerous. And he would travel on horseback, usually with one of his sons, his many sons, carrying a musket, and he would conduct the services for weddings and funerals and Sunday services. So James Kemper was quite a hero. Now, during this period, they had what they called in those days depredations. The depredations we would call today something like attacks or even terrorism. During a 4-year period, this very small population on the north side of the Ohio River living in these stations lost 1,500 of their daughters, their fathers, their sons, their mothers, brothers, sisters were taken by the Miami and the Shawnee. They didn't have very much chance of survival. Many of them were scalped, where they would be left to die slowly. Some were captured, especially the men, and they would be taken back to the Indian village and tortured. And it was extremely creative how they would torture their captives and sometimes make them last for up to 4 days of agony. If they were lucky, they might be marched north from the Ohio River all the way to Detroit in Michigan, where the British had a fort. And there they would be sold to the British, where they were offered as indentured servants or, in effect, slaves. Now, during this period, the British were offering $50 for each scalp and $100 for each hostage. And this was part of a strategy. This was not an accident. They were encouraging the Indians to attack because they wanted to terrorize the settlers and keep them from crossing the Alleghenies and the Appalachians and moving west. They had lost the Revolutionary War, but they didn't consider that they had lost the Northwest Territory. They still had their eyes on it. They were one of the superpowers who had sort of divided up the American continent as we know it today. And those powers were Great Britain, France, and Spain. And Great Britain had this whole Northwest Territory where we live now, sort of earmarked as going to be a part of Canada. And so as long as they could terrorize the settlers and force them backwards, back to the coast, they would be able to block expansion, and they would be able to protect their future expansion on the North American continent. Now, this was very well known to the settlers in those days. This is an early political cartoon. It depicts Miami or Shawnee Indians scalping a colonial settler and one of the militia officers. And then one of his Indian friends is collecting a bounty from a British officer. So they're very well aware that this is happening. They know what it means to the future of the country. So George Washington, reaching back into his memories of Ohio, he's decided that something has to be done. And he sends his first officer to conquer and suppress what they knew as the Indian Confederation. The Confederation was a collection of all of the tribes in the Midwest, including tribes in Michigan, such as the Huron and the Ottawa, in Tennessee, such as the Cherokee, and here in Ohio and Indiana, the Shawnee and the Miami, and many others, including elements from the East. So the first general who was sent out to suppress the Indians was General Josiah Harmer. And he was one of the heroes of the Revolutionary War. He was a very effective soldier, but after the war, he had become a drunk. He was incompetent. His men deserted in droves as he marched north into Ohio toward the border of Indiana, where he was going to battle the Indians. And they thought this would be a pretty easy mission. They thought the Indians were childlike savages who really didn't know the art of war the way they did. And he thought there would be really nothing to it. But when he got up there in the woods, he found out that Little Turtle and Blue Jacket were actually very good at military strategy. They surrounded him, they ambushed him, and they defeated him very soundly. It was a disgrace for the militias who he led into that, and many of them died. The second try came in 1791, and this time Washington moved up the scale to another Revolutionary War hero, General Arthur St. Clair. He was named by Washington to be the governor of the Northwest Territory. He gave the name to Cincinnati after a society he belonged to with George Washington called the Cincinnati Society. And before that, Cincinnati was known as Losantiville. Arthur St. Clair came to town, and he was very welcomed, and he was known as our Washington in Cincinnati. He was that well known from the Revolutionary War. And there was great hope that after the disaster with Harmar, that this would be the chance to finally defeat the Indian Confederation and stop the depredations. However, he made a lot of strategic mistakes and tactical mistakes. He took his men up to a place in Ohio, Fort Defiance, close to the Indiana border again. And he divided his troops across a river, which was a huge mistake. He had drawn cannons all the way up there, but the woods were so thick, he really couldn't deploy them or use them the way he wanted. They were surrounded and they were slaughtered. In fact, it was such a terrible massacre, it became known as the Battle of 1,000 Slain. And that's about how many people were lost to the settlers in St. Clair's army. His big mistake also was that he allowed his militia members and his regulars to bring their wives and children. So we had entire families who were in this camp when they were overrun, and the Indian tribes showed no mercy. They slaughtered everybody that was moving, and the ground was literally just covered with bodies and bones for years after. This, of course, was a huge defeat, and it was very demoralizing for the people in Cincinnati, and they were ready to move back to Pittsburgh and give up. However, George Washington now has decided that the militias are not getting the job done. There are too many desertions. St. Clair was unfit really to lead. It just wasn't getting the job done. So he goes to Congress and he gambles all of his political capital, and he asks for an amazing sum of $1 million. And he tells Congress this money is going to be used to form the United States' first professional army. Now, that was a little bit controversial too, because we had just fought a war to keep a professional army from occupying our homes on our shores. And Congress was not real thrilled about that idea. And then when he told them who he wanted to lead it, Congress was outraged, and so was Washington's own cabinet. And they protested and said it would be a total failure because he had selected Anthony Wayne. Now, Anthony Wayne was a very close friend of Washington's. He was with him at Valley Forge. There are many stories about how he got his name, Mad Anthony, and various versions of this, but the one that I chose for my book that I liked was the one where he got that from the Battle of Stony Point. But let's talk about, first, before we get to that, let's talk about who Anthony Wayne was after the war. During the war, he probably would have been a modern equivalent of the leader of special forces. He was the guy who could get anything done. He was a real gung-ho military leader. He inspired great confidence and morale in his troops. And he really was a terror on the battlefield. But after the war, he became a scoundrel. He was a failure. He was booted from Congress for voter fraud. He was bankrupt. He'd lost a plantation that was given to him from debt. He was afraid that he would actually be thrown into debtor's prison, and he was being investigated for all kinds of problems. But Washington knew his man. He knew that although he was a failure in peace, that this was the guy who could really make things happen on a battlefield. So how did he get that name? At the Battle of Stony Point in New York, during some of the darkest days of the Revolution, the British had occupied the high ground with their artillery at the top of a cliff that was almost a sheer face. It was a very, very steep incline. And Washington went to Anthony Wayne and said, "We need to take that hilltop." Anthony Wayne said, "I can do it, sir." And he ordered his men, he told them first they couldn't even load their muskets because he was afraid that as they climbed that cliffside at night, somebody might stumble and a musket would go off and the element of surprise would be lost. So he ordered them all to fix bayonets, and they began climbing that hilltop, and away they went straight up the hill. And they actually did take that artillery emplacement by the British and captured it. And it was a huge victory thanks to Anthony Wayne and his bayonets at midnight. Now, he has been entrusted with Washington to form this new U.S. Army. And in fact, he formed what was called the 1st Division of the U.S. Army, the 1st Infantry. And that still lives today in the U.S. Army as the Big Red One. You may have heard of that division. It has a very storied history and great heroics in World War II and World War I. So the Big Red One goes all the way back to Anthony Wayne. He taught his soldiers to fight like Indians. He taught them how Indians fight, that they don't fight like the British and line up and shoot at you across an open field. They have tactics of stealth and surprise and ambush and flanking maneuvers. And so he made his men ready. He built up their esprit de corps and their morale till they were very proud and ready for battle. So he begins leading this expedition from Cincinnati, and they're marching north into the middle of Ohio. On their way up, at each stage, he builds forts, which was a genius that he learned from reading military history from the Romans. And the idea was that these forts would protect his supply lines. This had been a big disaster for St. Clair and for Harmer before him, is that they didn't protect their supply lines, and they began to desert because they couldn't find anything to eat. They had no proper uniforms and ran out of powder and lead. So Anthony Wayne is marching north. Now let me introduce you to somebody else who's with him. This is Dr. James Wilkinson. He is a secret rival and a secret enemy of Anthony Wayne, yet he was appointed by Washington as Wayne's second in command. He was a bitter enemy of Wayne's because he believed that he was far more qualified to lead this expedition to put down the Indian Confederation. And unbeknownst to everybody but James Wilkinson and his handlers, during this whole period, he's also a spy for Spain. He's being paid by Spain to spy on the U.S. military and undermine and do whatever he can to sabotage Anthony Wayne. Now, we're going to find out later he is also suspected of being an assassin. And he is a very interesting character. So next we go to Middle Ohio. And near the top of Ohio, around Toledo, there's a place called the Maumee River in Maumee, Ohio. And that was where the site of the Battle of Fallen Timbers took place. There was a woods there that had been hit by a tornado in recent years, and all of the timber was lying on the ground. It was almost a natural fort. And the Indians had dug in there. And this is where Anthony Wayne chose to have his set piece battle against the Indian Confederation. Both sides were about evenly matched as far as numbers. This would be the big test for Wayne. And he lived up to his reputation as Mad Anthony once again after his charge up the cliffside at Stony Point by ordering his cavalry to charge right into the fallen timbers. This is a famous painting of that charge. It shows the captain who led the charge being shot and killed during the charge. But this was so effective, along with flank attacks by Wayne's infantry, that it routed the Indians, and they were completely surprised that anybody would charge into this natural fortress, and they began running. Now, they had been assured by the British that a fort a few miles away would be their refuge if things went wrong. And they began running back to that fort, chased by Wayne's cavalry and his infantry. And as they approached the fort, the British betrayed them and closed the doors on Fort Miami. Fort Miami was an illegal fort. It was outlawed by the treaty that settled the Revolutionary War. And so was the fort in Michigan, Fort Detroit. These were both on U.S. land in violation of the treaty, but the British were defiant. And these were their outposts where they would supply the Indians with powder and lead and muskets and knives and all the things they needed to wage war, where they would pay them for their hostages and scalps. And this was a big shock to the Indians when the British commander closed the doors to the fort and refused to let them have refuge there. The reason he did was that the British had just lost the war against the colonies, and for him to take in the Indians and then begin opening fire on Anthony Wayne would be the first shots in a new colonial war that was way above his pay grade, and he would have been in great disgrace and humiliation and court-martialed if he had done so. The British had their hands full with France at the time. They did not need another colonial front to fight on. And so he closed the doors and betrayed the Indians. So here's what happens thanks to Anthony Wayne in this battle. He has now defeated the Indian Confederation for the first in 3 times. They are suffering a major defeat, and it splintered their confederation, and they never really got together again until Tecumseh revived the Confederation in the War of 1812. So he has splintered and broken the Indian Confederation. Next, he has forced the British to betray them, and now he has broken the alliance between the British and the Indians. The Indians would no longer trust the British, and the British no longer could control and use the Indians as their proxy war against the settlers. And the third thing he did was, again, living up to his nickname, Mad Anthony. After the British commander closed the fort doors, the gates at Fort Miami, he rode up alone on horseback right under the palisades of the fort. It was the top of the palisades were lined with British soldiers holding muskets aimed at him, desperate and yearning to shoot him, but the commander, again, couldn't allow that. So Anthony Wayne defiantly rode under the gates of the fort and issued an ultimatum that they had to leave Ohio. So he has now forced the British out of Ohio. He has defeated the Indian Confederation, and he's broken up the alliance with the British. 3 masterful and strategic victories for the United States. So this led in the following August to the treaty at Greenville. Here we see the leaders of the Miami tribe and the Shawnee tribe signing a treaty, and in the background there is Anthony Wayne on the right, but behind him is William Henry Harrison, one of his top lieutenants, and also other famous military and civil leaders of our time of this period. So what this really, what was achieved through this treaty, thanks to Anthony Wayne, was we established the Northwest Territory with boundaries. We opened settlement north of the Ohio River for the first time for safe settlement. The Indians agreed to set all of their prisoners free, and they held a lot of white prisoners, and so did the British. And we had, for the first time, safe, free expansion to the west. The U.S. is now able to move west. The creation of all of these states in the Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota, all really credit their formation and their freedom and their being part of the United States to this treaty and to the victory at Fallen Timbers. There are scholars who make a good argument that the real defeat of the Indian Confederation was also the major victory of the pioneers and the settlers and the Europeans over the Native Americans on the continent. That everything after that was just a matter of, was the settlement kept expanding and going west farther and farther, and the Indians were dislocated and pushed farther and farther west to the Oklahoma Territory, to Montana, to all of these other western states. And although the battles out there were brutal and vicious, that these scholars say that that was all just cleanup. The real battle, the one that settled, you would say, perhaps the Normandy invasion victory of the early American period is the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Now, Wilson, during this period, while Anthony Wayne is in Greenville writing and settling this treaty, has launched attacks on Anthony Wayne. He writes an anonymous letter. He's sent back to Fort Washington, which is depicted here, on the banks of the Ohio, where he is made commander in Fort Washington. Again, nobody's aware that he is a spy for Spain. So he writes an anonymous letter that he sends to all of the government officials in the East, in Philadelphia, calling Wayne a drunkard, a liar, a fool, a feckless, ignorance in command, a coward, a hypocrite. Well, he's trying everything he can to destroy and sabotage Anthony Wayne. But when Anthony Wayne is getting a hero's welcome wherever he goes. When he goes back to Philadelphia, he rides in on his horse and he's greeted with what we'd call today a ticker tape parade, but it was waving hankies and flowers and throwing laurels at his feet. And even his old rival, Arthur St. Clair, who were bitter rivals during the Revolutionary War, has to write a letter commending him for setting free the Northwest Territory. Anthony Wayne is then assigned to go out and take possession of those forts in Detroit and Fort Miami. And he is there to have the British officers hand over their swords and surrender the forts personally to him. They are the forts that he has won in battle. And then what happens is things start to go very bad for Anthony Wayne. He is returning from that mission to take those forts, and he is on a small ship that's coming from Detroit to Presque Isle in Pennsylvania on Lake Erie. And he begins to get extremely ill. He died on December 3rd, 1796 in Presque Isle, Pennsylvania. He had malaria at the time. He suffered, like many men of his era, from very severe gout. But then he came down with something that his aides described as extreme torture of the stomach. Now, during this period, he had been investigating and trying to find out what was going on with Wilkinson, and he became suspicious of him. So he wrote a letter to the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, exposing Wilkinson as a spy and a traitor. And he believed that he was also a vile assassin, and that Wilkinson had tried to kill him on their campaign as they marched north to Maumee. There was a night when Anthony Wayne was sleeping in his tent, and a tree fell on his tent that crushed one of his legs partially. He survived, but the rest of his campaign was very painful. And when he inspected the tree, it had been sawn. So somebody sawed that tree in a manner that would make it fall directly on his tent. And he suspected Wilkinson, and he had a very good reason to do so, because his friends who had listened to Wilson talk about him when he was not present told him that Wilkinson was his most bitter and dangerous enemy. Anthony Wayne died in 1796, and he was buried in Wayne, Pennsylvania, on Valley Forge Road. All of those, this town named after him, and of course the road named after one of his great periods of service during the Revolutionary War. And ironically, the powers in Washington named James Wilkinson to replace him as commander of what we'd call the 1st Division of the U.S. Infantry. So Wilkinson got exactly what he was looking for. The symptoms that were described during Wayne's death fit precisely arsenic poisoning, which is colorless and tasteless and causes extreme stomach pain, joint pain, all of the things that Anthony Wayne suffered. And we have to remember that Wilkinson was a doctor. He would have known from medical school how to use arsenic and what it would do to its victim. So if we're going to say who saved America during this period, I'm going to vote for Mad Anthony Wayne, because he saved all of these states, this entire Northwest Territory, for settlement, for freedom, for expansion, for being part of the United States and its enormous area, all these resources, all this wonderful Midwest that we know and love and live in today was made free and available by his victory. There's a wonderful statue of him up in Maumee near the battlefield. And this statue shows Anthony Wayne in the middle, and he's flanked by an Indian scout holding a peace pipe, and on his left is a member of the militia, a settler, one of the original people, such as a Simon Kenton or a Daniel Boone, who settled this area. And they're represented with Wayne and the settler looking south through Ohio across all of this land that he has made free. It's just a great statue and a wonderful representation of his victory. And very inspiring. I recommend if you're traveling through the area, it's really worth a visit. And a man who has been long forgotten, who deserves, I think, a lot more credit for all of the things he's done for our country and what he did to save the Midwest and the Northwest Territory. I've written other books that I'll mention just briefly here, with a slide that shows you where they're available. Promised Land is available there. All of these are on my website, and they're also at Amazon. Also probably at your local library. And one of these is the one that I wrote before Promised Land, is The Man Who Saved Cincinnati. And this is about someone who's quite well known in Indiana, but hardly known at all in Cincinnati, and that's Lew Wallace. Those of you who know who he is, you know that he was called the scapegoat at Shiloh, that he was blamed unfairly for Grant's defeat on the first day at that battle. But then he went on to become the savior of Cincinnati during the siege of Cincinnati in 1862, when 10,000 Confederates, led by General Henry Heath, came north, and they got as far as Fort Mitchell, just on the other side of the Ohio River, and they were going to burn and loot and hold Cincinnati for ransom. It was Lew Wallace who arrived just in the nick of time before the city surrendered, and he built this amazing bridge. The first bridge that's depicted there at the bottom of the book was made of coal barges that were lashed together. And Lew Wallace saved Cincinnati in 3 days by building a bridge and declaring martial law and requiring every able-bodied man to carry a pick and a shovel or a musket and to march into northern Kentucky, where they saved the city. For those of you who know Cincinnati, An interesting item in that picture is in the background there, you see a tower. That is the original pier of the suspension bridge that was under construction before the war and that was finished after the war. So Lew Wallace saved Cincinnati. He became territorial governor of New Mexico after the war, where he captured Billy the Kid. He put down a range war, and he basically settled New Mexico and made it safe by also conquering Victorio and Geronimo in their Indian depredations out there. And in his spare time during this period, he also wrote an American classic, Ben-Hur. And that's only scratching the surface of this amazing man's accomplishments in his lifetime. The other two books I wrote were about organized crime. First in Northern Kentucky, called Forbidden Fruit. And this is about the 40-year empire of organized crime that led up to the Supper Club fire in 1977 that claimed 165 lives. The fire investigator that I spoke to, who had studied this extensively, called it the biggest unsolved mass murder cold case in U.S. history. So there's an amazing amount of evidence that I was able to uncover by doing Freedom of Information Act requests through the FBI. They have something called the Vault, which contains all of this formerly classified information or secret information that you can now obtain if you know the right words to work the combination in their vault. And it showed beyond any doubt, really, that this was no accident. The Supper Club fire was arson. And then the next book that I wrote was called Not in Our Town, and that is the story of Cincinnati's battle against organized crime and their effort to keep the darkest parts of organized crime from coming north across the Ohio River. By the time the mob was trying to move into Cincinnati, their main moneymaker was porn. They had moved on from bootleg after Prohibition was repealed. Casino gambling was not as popular as it had been. State lotteries were catching on. So they moved into the pornography industry. During the 1990s, the FBI did a study that showed that 90% of all the adult businesses in the US were run directly by two organized crime families. And that was true in Cincinnati, where the face of organized crime was Larry Flint and his hustler empire. And he came to town with a bankroll and opened his first hustler club. He claimed that he was an entrepreneurial genius, but in fact, he had already bankrupted 11 different bars in Dayton, Ohio. So he really didn't know what he was doing. But he did have a lot of money to open a hustler club, and that money was a direct loan from the Cleveland mob. So he was a mob guy all the way. And that was a fascinating story about how Cincinnati fought a quiet, untold, really, war to keep the mob out of Cincinnati and keep Cincinnati safe and free of organized crime for the most part. I've probably talked enough, and I know how hard it is to listen to somebody talk as much as I have. So I'm glad to entertain some questions and see what maybe people can even offer me some things I don't know about Anthony Wayne that I'd love to hear. So, or any of these topics. So if you have any questions, by all means, let me know.
We do have a couple of questions for you. So one of them that I see in the chat is, how big was the Great Black Swamp?
The Great Black Swamp. Oh, that's a good question. I really can't tell you. I remember running across that when I was doing my research about Anthony Wayne's march, and it's a fascinating. Can somebody else perhaps contribute to that?
Let's see what else we might have, and then we can try to maybe take a closer look. Oh, somebody says in the chat, it covered about 1,500 square miles in Northwest Ohio and stretched down to the east edge of Fort Wayne.
Wow.
Thank you. So let's look here. So someone is also asking, was there a station on the river raisin between Fort Detroit and Fort Miami?
There probably was. There were a lot of stations on the eastern side of Ohio. They were almost invariably on the river because that was the method of transportation. That was the superhighway. We had probably, I don't know, maybe 15 to 20 stations right around the Ohio River in Cincinnati. But then gradually, as people became more established after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, people began to move their stations a little deeper into the interior away from the rivers. But I would guess there probably were. What's interesting is you travel around Ohio in our neighborhood here in Cincinnati too. You'll find a lot of little roads in the country that are called something like Harper Station or Jones Station Road. And these probably, long lost to our memory and history, these are places that were at one time little stockades and stations for people.
Thank you. Somebody says here in the Q&A that old family lore said a relative was aide de camp to Mad Anthony Wayne. Do you have any suggestions to research or confirm that?
Yes, if you can get access, but you may have to make a personal visit, or they may be able to help you online. They're very helpful there. But the Museum Center's historical archives have some fantastic muster rolls from his original 1st Infantry. Officers are listed. One of the aide-de-camps with and Mad Anthony Wayne was William Henry Harrison, which is where he learned an awful lot from Anthony Wayne about military tactics and Indian fighting that led to his victories and eventually led to him being elected president. So one of the people standing there in that picture of the Treaty of Greenville is William Henry Harrison.
Thank you. Let's see. So how would you describe your research process when working on the book, and which resources did you utilize most?
Well, I love the research almost as much as the writing, and I call this really the golden age of research, because when I was working at a newspaper, it might take me sometimes days or even weeks to find something I really wanted to find out. Today, I can usually do that in a matter of a few clicks on a mouse, on a keyboard. If you know where to look, there are fantastic national archives. There are historical societies, first-person documents. And then, of course, I read a lot of books because, let's face it, all history is based on, we stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. The primary sources, the people who wrote these books way back. Daniel Boone wrote a book. He tells us about Simon Kenton. He tells us about the early settlers. And all of these people have contributed to this vast treasure trove of history that we can tap into. I find a lot of times in doing research, that's one of the great joys, because it is so often that you find serendipitous connections. You'll start to follow a name and it'll lead to somebody else. And then you find this, like, for example, the story of the suspected assassination of Anthony Wayne by James Wilkinson. That comes only from finding out, okay, who is his second in command? And then you go, who is this guy? And you start following it, and it's an amazing story. So my research is pretty omnivorous. I use all kinds of sources, but I would say the primary ones are internet research, databases such as the FBI, the National Archives, historical societies, local and broader. The Cincinnati Museum Center Historical Society is a fantastic resource. Museums also. So, and it takes me around a little bit, so I travel from time to time to various museums to tap into their resources.
That's helpful. Thank you. It looks like somebody else is curious if Wayne had a connection to the Macomb family, if you came across that in your research.
No, I didn't see that. It kind of makes sense, though, because you have, if this is a Macomb family from Michigan, it would be the Macomb County and Wayne County are, pretty close together there. So it seems kind of possible. It'd be interesting to look into that. That's a good one. I should check it out.
And someone else is asking, where did you find Daniel Boone's book?
Go to Amazon and look for, just plug in Daniel Boone and you'll find his book. You'll find one by his son. You'll find books about Boone, including one that was written by one of his close friends, a man who knew him pretty well. And but you can find a lot of first-person accounts from Daniel Boone too that are on the internet by looking up his history, just kind of browsing and following links. You'll eventually find some of his accounts of battles. Of course, the writing in the English is pretty fractured even for its time. He was not a very literate man, but he was quite an adventurer and quite a hero. His life, in fact, though, was saved by Simon Kenton in one instance during an Indian attack, and when they were under attack near a fort, and Simon Kenton arrived to rescue Boone and actually picked him up and carried him into the fort because he'd been shot in the leg. Yeah, there's some amazing stories about Daniel Boone. That's where I'd start. I'd go to Amazon or your local library and just see what they have. In fact, I would imagine Kate probably has some Daniel Boone books on the shelves there.
Thank you. So I think that might finish us up for questions. Oh, we have one more. Someone's asking if you have any genealogical information on Lew Wallace.
The place to go for Lew Wallace information is called the Lew Wallace Study and Museum in Crawfordsville, Indiana. It's about, maybe 45 minutes west of Indianapolis, a little bit south on the Wabash River. And this is an amazing place. I really recommend it as a day trip. The museum was built and designed by Lew Wallace. He was also an inventor. He invented the first collapsible fishing rod. He invented all kinds of things. He was a sculptor. He is an artist. His examples of all of these things are there in the museum. He taught himself to play the fiddle, and then that wasn't enough, so he began to make his own. And he was quite accomplished at that. And he did a lot of writing there at the Study and Museum under a huge beech tree that was stood there for years. And then I guess within about 3 weeks of his death, it was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. Very interesting little tidbit. And but his Study and Museum is fascinating. It's a great resource, and you can learn a lot about. He was the son of Indiana's governor. He never finished school past about the 8 years old. He would run away every time he was asked to go to school or forced to go to school. And just an amazing self-taught person, a real Renaissance man.
Thank you. So I think that's where we will end today, but I did put our email address in the chat. So if anybody has any follow-up questions, or if you'd like a copy of the chat, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info. And thank you again very much, Peter, for a great presentation today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Kate. It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your hospitality, and thank you for the great questions.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye.